Are you going to live your whole life renting, you useless old man? That's what my son said to me. Just like that, without a second thought. Cold. His voice was loud. In front of his wife and my two grandsons, they were right there playing with toy cars on the living room floor. He said it with contempt, like he wanted it to hurt me. And it did. It hurt. I didn't answer him. I stayed quiet because sometimes you don't know if it's even worth responding, or if you should just endure one more thing. But I swear something inside me broke that day. My name is Ezekiel. I'm 78 years old, and even though I don't have the strength I used to, my mind is still sharp. I've lived my whole life here in this city. I was a bricklayer, a helper, then a foreman, and later a real estate agent. More than 40 years surrounded by dust, dirt, cement, and deeds. And it was there between blueprints and promises that I built my name. It wasn't easy, but I did it. And I also managed to build a small fortune, which I decided to keep to myself. Because you learn things over the years. Some things are better left unsaid. It's better to just watch and see how far people will go, even your own blood. My son Daniel never knew hunger. He never knew what it was like to open the pantry and not even find a can of beans. When he was a boy, I was still out there mixing mortar and carrying heavy bags under the hot sun, all so that he would never lack for anything. And even though I'd come home exhausted, I would still sit on the floor with him. I'd make him little cars out of cardboard. I told him stories. I taught him how to be a man. His mother, God rest her soul, always used to tell me our Danny is not going to live the life we lived. And that's why I worked twice as hard. I gave him school summer courses, nice clothes, vacations, everything I could. But sometimes the more you give, the less you're valued. That day, it all started with an innocent comment. I told him that maybe it was time for me to find a smaller place, that the rent was getting a little heavy for me. I didn't even ask him for help. I just said it like a father talking to his son. But he went straight for the throat. He said I was always complaining about the same thing, that I should figure it out on my own, that no one is obligated to support old people. And then he let it slip. That sentence that still echoes in my head. Are you going to live your whole life renting, you useless old man? Slowly got up from the armchair. I looked at him calmly. And I just said, thank you for everything, Daniel. I kissed my grandsons on the forehead. I took my hat. And I left. Without shouting. Without making a scene. I just left. And he didn't even realize that it was the last time he would ever see me walk through his front door. Because in that moment, I had already decided. I will never let myself be humiliated by anyone again. But before I continue with this story, listen carefully to what I'm about to say. Maybe you've gone through something similar. Maybe someone made you feel small. Less than. Like you were worthless. If so, do one thing. Listen to this story until the very end, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And then tell me what part touched your heart, and what city are you listening from. Because life teaches you lessons, and what I've learned is worth more than gold. That afternoon, as I walked through my neighborhood with the sun setting and a lump in my throat, 1,000 memories came flooding back. Every house I passed, I knew who lived there, who was renting, who was selling, who was in debt. I wasn't just some old man walking down the street. I was Ezekiel, and still my own son treated me like I was a burden, like I was useless, like I was invisible. And you know what hurts more than humiliation? When it comes from someone you raised with love, someone you gave everything for, someone who forgot everything you ever did for them. But the silence I held in my chest turned into a decision. Because a man can be patient, but he's not a fool. That night alone in my apartment, I sat in the kitchen, opened a beer, turned on the old radio, and a classic love song my late wife adored started to play. And right there, between sips and memories, I thought, that's enough. I've had enough of pretending I'm in need, of pretending I'm dependent. It's time to show that the one who stays silent also knows how to act, and that you demand respect with dignity, not with shouting. So I stood up, went to my closet, and took out my black briefcase, the one nobody ever touches. I opened it, and there they were. All the deeds, the titles, the contracts, the stock certificates, the keys. 15 properties in my name. Yes, 15. Houses, apartments, commercial spaces, all with tenants, all generating income, all mine. And the most ironic part, one of the biggest real estate agencies in the city, that was mine too. But nobody knew. Because I never bragged. I was always discreet. But that day I decided I wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. That the best answer wasn't an insult, but an action. That the greatest revenge is to live with dignity. But before I made any moves, I needed to think carefully about what I was going to do with it all. Because owning something is one thing, knowing how to use it is another. And right there, an idea started to form. And that idea grew over the following days, all while he sent me text messages as if nothing happened. While my daughter-in-law posted photos with captions like, "Family is the most important thing." And I was just there watching it all, silent. I wanted them to get comfortable. I wanted them to think the useless old man was struggling to pay rent, counting his pennies, watching TV alone. Because when the time came, I wanted to see the look on their faces. And believe me, you can't even imagine what came next. 2 days later, Daniel texted me as if nothing had happened. "Did you eat, Dad?" it said. Pure hypocrisy. It wasn't concern, it was habit. Because when someone truly offends you and doesn't even realize it, it's because they lost respect for you a long time ago. I didn't reply. I left him on red. That was my first step. Because sometimes silence says more than 1,000 words. And then I started to prepare everything. I called my accountant and my old lawyer Matthew, a friend I'd known for decades, ever since he helped me with my first piece of land. I told him, "Get everything ready for me. I'm going to make some changes." I didn't explain much. I just said I wanted to get my will in order. Review my contracts, update the deeds, and above all, make sure that my son would not touch a single thing that was mine. Not 1 cent. Matthew looked at me in silence, offered me a coffee, and while he reviewed the papers, he asked, "Are you sure, Ezekiel?" "More sure than ever." "Did something happen with Daniel?" "The usual, but this time he crossed the line." "Then we'll set everything up just as you say. But we'll do it right. Legal and clean." That's how we began. Property by property, we verified every tenant who wanted to renew their lease who didn't. We reviewed clauses, insurance policies, bank accounts. And by the end of that week, Daniel was officially out of everything. Out of the company, out of the will, off all authorizations, even off the life insurance policy I had set up for him for when I was gone. Everything. Absolutely everything was revoked. No drama, no scandal, just ink and law. And of course I didn't tell him a thing. Because a plan made with a cool head is a plan that succeeds. And I wasn't going to waste my energy fighting with someone who didn't even value the bread he put in his mouth thanks to me. During that time, I spent more hours walking around the city than I did at home. It wasn't sadness. It was analysis. I went from neighborhood to neighborhood checking on my properties. Some needed a coat of paint, others were in better shape than I remembered. I went to see some of my tenants, chatted with them like it was nothing. No one knew I was the owner. They treated me like any other curious old man out for a walk. And that got me thinking, maybe that's what I want now, to be invisible. For no one to know, for no one to expect anything, and for no one to ask me for anything more. One day I passed by one of my oldest houses, one in the Miller Park neighborhood. It was a corner house with a small front yard and green iron fences that I myself had installed over 20 years ago. I sat on the curb across the street under the shade of a maple tree with my hat pulled low and my cane resting between my legs. And as I looked at that house, I thought about everything I had lived through there. My mother lived there. I brought my wife there when we got married. Daniel was born there. And suddenly, the memories hit me like a storm. The sound of a child's shouts, the games, my wife's laughter, the smell of her cooking coming from the kitchen. A tear rolled down my cheek. But not a tear of sadness. A tear of closure. Because I understood that that chapter was over. That same day I called Matthew. I told him I want to sell the house in Miller Park, but not to just anyone. I want it to go to someone who will value it. And how are you going to know who deserves it? He asked me. I'll know it when I look into their eyes. And that's what happened. Not even a week later, a young widow with 2 little girls asked about the property. She was an elementary school teacher, the kind who still teaches with her whole soul. When I met her, she shook my hand firmly, but with humility. She looked me straight in the eye and said, I don't have much, but I have the will to raise my daughters with dignity. And I knew that house was for them. We made a fair deal, no haggling, no unnecessary paperwork. Because sometimes a heart recognizes another heart. And I felt that my story in that house should continue with someone who knew what it meant to fight. While all of this was happening, Daniel kept up his act. He would call me, leave voicemails, have the kids send me drawings. As if nothing happened. As if the poison of that sentence hadn't been spilled into my soul. As if a simple "Hi, Dad" could erase the contempt. But I didn't answer. Not because I didn't love my grandsons, but because sometimes love needs boundaries too. And I was no longer willing to be anyone's sad clown. One Saturday afternoon, as I was walking through the downtown square, I saw a sign posted in the window of one of my rental offices. Administrative assistant wanted real estate experience preferred. And I got curious. I went inside and saw a new girl at the desk, a young woman who didn't know me. I walked up to her and asked, "Have you found someone for the position yet?" "Not yet, sir." "What if a 78-year-old man with over 40 years of experience applied?" She laughed. "If he really has that experience, I'd hire him myself." And just like that, symbolically, I offered to help out a couple of days a week, just to stay active. They had no idea I was the real owner of the whole operation. They treated me like a wise old man, and I enjoyed the game. I taught them things, solved problems, spoke to them with patience. And no one called me a useless old man. No one. On the contrary. They offered me coffee, asked for my advice, gave me the respect I deserved. And right there I understood something else. You don't demand respect by shouting. You earn it with your presence, with your integrity, with your dignity. And if your own blood doesn't recognize you, don't worry. God gives you a family of the heart when the one you were born into fails you. I no longer expected anything from Daniel. But even so, destiny had more surprises in store. Because when you plant seeds of truth, life sooner or later gives you flowers, even if others only ever threw stones at you. And it was on one of those ordinary days that my apartment doorbell rang. And when I opened the door, it wasn't Daniel. It was someone else. And what he told me changed the course of everything. When I opened the door and saw who was standing there, I had to take a deep breath so my emotions wouldn't betray me. It was Thomas, an old friend, almost a brother, who I hadn't seen in over 15 years. He wore the same old hat, had the same thick mustache, more pronounced wrinkles, but the same honest eyes he'd always had. We just stood there for a few seconds looking at each other without a word, as if time had stopped right there in the doorframe. And then he simply said, "Got any coffee?" And I smiled. "The best in the city, old friend." We sat at the kitchen table just like in the old days. Steam rose from our mugs while the neighborhood dogs started barking outside. It was as if the whole world knew something important was happening. And it was. What Thomas came to tell me was no small thing, because sometimes life puts someone in front of you just when you need them most. And that visit changed the course of everything. "I just heard from Matthew that you made changes to your will, that you're closing some chapters," he said, stirring his sugar slowly, without looking at me directly. "That's right. It was time. And you did it all because of what Daniel said to you." I stayed quiet. I didn't feel like repeating that phrase. I did it for everything he didn't say, too. Thomas nodded as if he understood every silence. He was always like that, more of a listener than a talker. And then he dropped the bomb he'd been holding back. "There's something you need to know, something that's going to hurt, but I'd rather you hear it from me." In that moment, I felt the air freeze. I don't know why, but I knew what was coming wasn't good. And I wasn't wrong. He told me that Daniel had tried to sell one of my properties. Yes, one of the ones that was still under an old contract from back when I had given him power of attorney to handle certain things when I was sick years ago. Apparently, he thought he still had that access and had contacted a buyer. But thank God the documents were already updated and protected. The sale was rejected, but the fact that he tried, it was another knife in the back. "How did you find out?" One of my clients, a friend of the potential buyer, mentioned it to me, and it sounded strange. So I went and checked for myself and confirmed everything. I didn't want to call you before because I wanted to tell you face to face. I stood up, walked to the window. Outside, a boy on a bicycle with a basket of bread rode by. Life went on as if nothing had happened, but inside me everything was churning. It wasn't just rage, it was disappointment. A level of disappointment I didn't even know I could feel. "Thank you, Thomas. You did the right thing by coming. What are you going to do?" "I'm going to finish what I started, but this time without mercy." I didn't say it with hate. I didn't say it shouting. I said it with the peace of someone who is no longer willing to carry any more weight than necessary. And it was then that Thomas looked at me seriously and said something that stuck with me. "Justice isn't always revenge, Ezekiel. Sometimes it's just about putting everything in its proper place." When he left, I sat there for hours thinking. Not just about Daniel, but about everything. About my life, about what I'd built, about the times I stayed silent, about the times I gave in. And I decided I wasn't going to die leaving things like this. Because my story deserved to be told. And because maybe out there was someone who needed to hear it. So that very night, I took out a thick-paged notebook, the kind you buy with excitement and save for something important. And I began to write. In large, clear, slow handwriting, as if each word was a piece of myself I was putting on record. I wasn't doing it for Daniel. I was doing it for me, for myself. So I wouldn't forget who I am. To remember that I have value, that I lived, that I fought. I wrote about my childhood, about my mother washing other people's clothes, about my father who left and never came back. I wrote about when I met Teresa, my wife, at a neighborhood party, dancing under colored lights. I wrote about our struggles, our laughter, our dreams. About the day Daniel was born, and how I cried silently in the hospital waiting room. About the times I took off my worn-out shoes before coming inside so he wouldn't see that his dad was also going through hard times. I wrote everything, because sometimes you need to read your own story to find yourself again. The days went by. I continued my quiet visits to the properties. I'd greet the neighbors, stop by the church, have coffee at the same old cafe. And slowly I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. The kind of peace that comes when you no longer expect anything from anyone. When you no longer beg for affection or attention or recognition. When you accept yourself completely. But Daniel's silence was getting louder. He no longer sent messages, no longer called. He didn't even use the grandkids as a bridge anymore. Maybe because he knew something was truly broken. Or maybe because he was waiting for the right moment to strike again. And that moment came. One Friday night, I received a notification. An attempt to place a legal claim signed by a young lawyer with a foreign-sounding last name. Apparently, Daniel was arguing that part of the estate was his, that he had made contributions years ago, that he had a legitimate right to some of the properties. All of it based on old papers, false verbal agreements, and a narrative that only he believed. But what he didn't know was that I had saved everything. Every receipt, every bank transfer, every contract. And besides that, nothing was in his name anymore. Everything was protected, legally solid, impossible to touch. The next day, I went to that lawyer's office in person. I introduced myself like any other client. I handed him a folder with all the documentation. He reviewed it in silence. And when he finished, he looked at me with a startled expression. "Mr. Ezekiel, with this documentation, your son has absolutely no claim to any of this." "I know. I just wanted to see your face when you said it." I stood up, shook his hand, and walked out with my head held high. Because it's one thing to protect yourself. It's another thing entirely to prove you're no fool. That night I slept better than I had in years. Not because everything was resolved, but because, finally, everything was clear. The masks had fallen off. The intentions were out in the open. And me, the useless old man I had won without lifting another finger. The following days passed with a strange calmness. On the outside, everything was the same. The same coffee in the mornings, the walks to the market, the greetings from neighbors. But inside, I felt that something had finally settled into its place. It wasn't about revenge, not even about pride. It was something deeper, a serene certainty. I no longer had any outstanding debts to anyone, not even to my own son. One morning while I was sweeping the entrance of my building, just because I liked to keep it clean, a neighbor approached me, Mrs. Emily, an 85-year-old woman who had lived alone for over 2 decades. "Mr. Ezekiel, there's something different about you lately. I see you're calmer, you walk taller." Maybe it's because I finally understood that silence also speaks. She smiled as if she knew exactly what I was talking about. That conversation left me thinking. Sometimes we think no one sees what we're going through, but there are eyes that watch in silence. Eyes that understand without needing an explanation. And it was right there that I decided something. I wasn't going to leave this world without leaving a clearer mark. Not just for myself, but for other old folks like me who have been silenced, ignored, disrespected. Because yes, being old in this country is almost like being invisible. And I didn't want to be invisible anymore. I went to the file where I kept my important documents and took out a large envelope with my real estate company's letterhead. Inside were the blueprints for a piece of land I hadn't used in years. A large lot on the outskirts of the city that many had offered to buy, but I never wanted to sell because I always felt I should do something more with it. And now I knew. I was going to build a center for senior citizens there, but not just any center. Not one of those places where they lock you up and strip you of your dignity, no. I wanted a free, community-oriented place where the elderly could teach, talk, garden, and share, where experience wasn't discarded but listened to, where no one would ever be called useless again. I called an old architect I had worked with in the past. I told him my idea. He listened to me with respect without interrupting. "Ezekiel, are you sure this is a huge project?" "Nah. Raising my son alone was a bigger project, and I did it without complaining." We shook hands, and in less than a week we had the first sketches. A simple building with a community garden, spacious rooms, a small library, a workshop area, and a relaxation area, all designed to be self-sustaining, and the best part, non-profit. Little by little, I started to gather trustworthy people. An accountant, a lawyer, a social worker, good committed people. No one knew exactly where the money was coming from, and they didn't ask. They respected me, and that was enough. One afternoon, while we were reviewing papers at a downtown cafe, someone sat down at the table next to us. I didn't see him right away, but his voice, it froze me. "Dad." It was Daniel. He looked at me as if he'd seen a ghost. His shirt was unbuttoned, his beard was overgrown, his eyes were tired. He wasn't the same arrogant son who had yelled at me in his living room. No. This man looked defeated. I remained silent. I observed him. He also looked at me in silence as if waiting for something. But I had no words for him. Not in that moment. "Can we talk?" "Not right now. I'm busy." "Can I call you later?" "Do whatever you want, Daniel. But I don't owe you anything." He just stood there, not knowing what to say, like a lost child, and then he simply walked away. I didn't wish him ill, nor did I wish him well. I felt no hatred, no pity, just distance, as if he were someone I once knew but who was no longer part of my story. The days continued their course. The construction of the center began. Slow but steady. I went every morning to supervise. I would sit in a chair next to the site and watch the construction workers. It brought back memories of my younger years. Sometimes one of them would offer me a tortilla with salt or a cup of coffee. I felt alive, useful, and above all, at peace. One afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. It was the teacher who had bought the house in the Miller Park neighborhood. She came with her daughters. She hugged me tightly. "Thank you, Mr. Ezekiel. Thank you for trusting me. That house has changed our lives." I looked at her with tenderness. I didn't need to hear anything else. Her gratitude was worth more than any inheritance. That night I wrote in my notebook, "When you give from the heart, life gives it back to you multiplied." Sometimes not in the form of money, but in the form of purpose. And so it was. Because while many turned their backs on me, others, people who weren't even my own blood, gave me warmth. They gave me a place. They restored my faith. One Sunday, while I was reading in my old armchair, the phone rang. It was a call from the real estate office. One of my managers told me that Daniel had tried to enter one of the properties, claiming it belonged to the family. They had to call security. "Do you want us to file a formal restraining order, Mr. Ezekiel?" "No, that's not necessary. He's just realizing that he no longer has a place." I hung up and sighed. It wasn't anger. It was reality. And even though it hurt, I had learned to live with it. Because sometimes the hardest thing to accept is that your children can also leave and never come back. From that day on, something finally settled inside of me. I no longer asked myself why Daniel had done what he did. Nor did I wear myself out looking for someone to blame or searching for signs in the past. When a son chooses the path of arrogance and contempt, it's not always because of a lack of love received. Sometimes it's simply because he never learned to be grateful. I had given everything. Time, effort, my life. But I understood with the maturity that only the years can give that love doesn't always come back in the way you expect. And you have to learn to let go. Not out of resentment, but for the sake of dignity. That's why I continued with the Community Center for Senior Citizens project, as if it were my only mission in life. Because in a way it was. I would wake up early, make my coffee with cinnamon, put on my hat, and walk to the construction site. The workers would be there to greet me warmly, as if I were just another member of the team. I sat in the same chair every day with my blueprints spread out on a wooden table, and I reviewed every detail. The center was taking shape. The structure for the dining hall was up the columns for the library too, and the courtyard had a space marked out for the garden, where, God willing, I was going to teach anyone who wanted to learn how to plant tomatoes, green onions, and cilantro. I wasn't looking for recognition or plaques with my name on them. I just wanted to see other old folks smiling again. Men and women who, like me, had been pushed aside, forgotten by their children, ignored by society. I wanted to give them a place where they didn't have to ask for permission to exist. One Friday, as I was finishing up my review of the day's progress, a young man approached me. He was one of the new helpers, no more than 20 years old, thin, with a timid look in his eyes. He offered me a bottle of water and said, "Mr. Ezekiel, can I ask you a question?" I nodded. "Why do you do all this?" "You're old enough to be resting." I laughed, not in a mocking way, but with the kind of laugh that comes when you know that youth doesn't yet understand life. I told him, because resting isn't the same as giving up, and because if you have something to give, you should give it until your last breath. The young man stood there thinking, then looked down and said, "My grandfather was like that too, but my dad never loved him. He died alone." I looked at him, put my hand on his shoulder, and replied, "Then you honor him. Be the grandson he would have wanted to see." The boy got emotional, wiped his eyes, and went back to work. And I stayed there looking at the sky, feeling that even though I didn't have my blood family close, something was blossoming inside of me. Something pure. Something true. A couple of days later, I received a handwritten letter in my mailbox. I recognized the handwriting from the first stroke. It was from Daniel. There was no return address. It just said Dad Choth on the front. I sat in the living room, opened the paper carefully as if it were made of glass, and began to read. "Dad, I don't know how to start this letter. I'm ashamed to write to you after everything that happened. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just want to explain. Ever since Mom died, I felt like you pulled away, that you closed yourself off, that you weren't the same person. I felt alone, confused, and instead of getting closer, I became hard, demanding, bitter. What I said to you that day, it's unforgivable, I know. I went too far. But I want you to know that I've regretted it every single day since. I see you from a distance. I know what you're doing. I heard about the center. I know you cut me out of everything, and that's fine. You deserve it all. I don't deserve anything. I just wanted you to know that I admire you, that even though I never said it, you were always my hero, and that if one day you want to, even just to talk, I'll be here. Your son, Daniel." I sat in silence for a long time. I didn't cry, but I felt a pang in my chest that I couldn't name. I didn't answer the letter. Not because I held a grudge, but because I didn't need to respond. That was his business, his process. And if at some point life brought us together again, it would be because it was meant to be. I was done chasing after anyone. Not anymore. Meanwhile, the center continued to grow. The day came when we opened the first door. It was a Sunday morning. We invited a small group of seniors from different neighborhoods. Men with canes, women in shawls, some in wheelchairs. As they came through the main gate, I saw their faces transform. It was as if they were entering a sanctuary. There were comfortable chairs, hot coffee, sweet-bread books open on the tables, soft music playing in the background. I watched them sit, chat, laugh. One started telling jokes, another pulled an old harmonica from his pocket and started to play. And then I knew that it had all been worth it. Every tear, every silence, every humiliation. It had all led me to this. That night when I got home, I sat in my armchair, took out my notebook, and wrote a single sentence. Today I was born again. And I felt it. Because being reborn isn't about starting from scratch. It's about starting from the truth. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. I don't know if Daniel will come back, if my grandsons will want to know me, if life will give me many more years. But today, at 78, I know I didn't leave this world without leaving something good behind. And that no one can take from me. After that first opening of the center, life began to have a different rhythm. I no longer woke up feeling alone in the world. Now I knew that every day someone was waiting for a conversation, a story, a cup of coffee, or just company. Because sometimes what a person needs most isn't money or grand things, but to be seen, to be heard. And there in that center, born from the ashes of my sadness, something I hadn't felt in years began to blossom. Purpose. I still wasn't looking for recognition, not in the press, not on social media, not in any of that. But people in the neighborhood were starting to talk. Did you hear what Mr. Ezekiel did? They say he built the whole thing with his own money. Who would have thought him being so quiet and doing so much good? Those phrases reached my ears, and though I said nothing inside, I felt strong. Not proud, but complete. Because you don't need to boast about what is true. One Wednesday afternoon, while supervising a painting workshop for elderly ladies, a tall man with glasses, well-dressed, approached me. He introduced himself as a journalist from a local paper. He said he'd heard about the center and wanted to do a story, an interview, something to spread the word about what we were doing. I answered him politely. Look, son, I didn't do this to be in any newspaper. But if your story will help other seniors find out there's a place for them here, then write it. But only use my name if you have to. Because what matters isn't who did it, but who it was done for. He smiled and shook my hand. 2 days later, a small article came out with a photo of the center without my picture, just my name at the end. And I couldn't have imagined what that would cause. In the following weeks, dozens of new people arrived. Grandparents from other neighborhoods, from poorer areas, women who came from nursing homes where they were treated like old rags. Some cried upon entering. One of them, Mrs. Margaret, hugged me tightly and said, Mr. Ezekiel, I thought I had nothing left in life, but this place has given me back my soul. And I was speechless, because there is no greater reward than knowing your pain served to heal the pain of others. One Saturday morning, while we were setting up new chairs in the dining hall, someone I didn't expect to see appeared at the entrance. It was my oldest grandson. He was almost 15 now, tall, thin, with the same look his father had at his age. He searched for me with his eyes until he found me, and when he saw me, he gave me a shy smile. He walked toward me and stood in silence. I stopped what I was doing and watched him. I hadn't seen him in months, not since that day in the living room when his father yelled the unforgivable at me. I didn't know if I should hug him, if I should say something, but he spoke first. Grandpa, can I stay with you for a while? I nodded. I gave him a chair. He sat next to me. We didn't talk much. He just watched me work sometimes, asking questions about tools, materials, about how a wall is built, and I answered him with patience just as I once did with his father. At the end of the day before leaving, he said, "Dad doesn't know I came, but I wanted to see you because Mom told us what you're doing, and I wanted to see if it was true." I put my hand on his shoulder and said, "And what do you think?" He hugged me and whispered, "I'm proud of you, Grandpa." And that was it. Nothing more was needed because sometimes a single sentence is enough to heal 1,000 wounds. That night I couldn't sleep. I thought about Daniel, about how that boy I held with such joy when he was born turned into a cold man, blinded by arrogance. And I also thought that maybe with time life would teach him what I no longer could. Because there comes a point where you're no longer there to give lessons. You're there to live in peace, and if one day he wanted to come back, he would have to do it from a place of humility, not remorse. Meanwhile, the center kept growing. Every day more people came, more workshops opened, more hot meals were served. Groups for reading, singing, and knitting were formed. The garden already had green tomatoes, marigolds, and even a small section of medicinal plants. People arrived early. Some carried their stories in their eyes. Others carried scars. But everyone found a corner where they could feel alive. And then something unexpected happened. A city foundation came to visit us. They had heard about the center from the newspaper article. They wanted to support us with materials, with volunteers, even with doctors who would come to give free consultations. They offered me a partnership. They showed me figures, proposals, statistics. And while they talked, I watched them carefully. In the end, I told them, "I don't need this to become a business. If you want to help, do it from the heart. There are no bosses here. Here we are all one. If you respect that, you are welcome." And they accepted. Because when the truth is clear, it doesn't need to be defended. That night, as I closed the last door of the center, I stood for a moment looking at the sky. The full moon shone on the newly painted roof, and I thought maybe if my wife is watching me from somewhere, she's smiling, and that was enough. Because everything I still did with her in my heart. Always. A few weeks passed after my grandson's visit, and I didn't hear from Daniel again. No message, no letter, no sign. And to be honest, I wasn't expecting it. I didn't need it. Because something inside me had already closed like an old wound that had stopped bleeding. Not because it had healed completely, but because you learn to live with the scar. I remained focused on the center, which now had a name, the grandparents' house. A simple name, but full of truth. Because that's what it was, a home. A place where the elderly weren't a nuisance, a burden, or an annoyance. Where every wrinkle told a story. And every slow step had its own dignity. The activities continued to grow. A group of ladies organized a traditional cooking class, and another group of men began restoring old furniture. Every time I passed by, I could hear them laughing, arguing over recipes, sharing secrets of trades that almost no one remembered anymore. One day, one of the grandpas, Mr. Roger, told me while sanding a chair, "Ezekiel, here I feel useful again. It's like you've given me back the years I thought I had lost." And those words were etched into my soul. Because all this effort, every brick, every dollar invested, was worth it if it could give someone back the feeling of belonging. But not everything was calm. One morning while having coffee in the center's backyard, I got a phone call. It was Matthew, my lawyer. His voice sounded tense. He said, "We need to meet. It's about Daniel." I felt a chill down my spine, but I didn't ask questions. I told him I would stop by his office in the afternoon. When I arrived, he had a folder of documents ready for me. He opened it on the table and began to explain. "Your son is in debt up to his neck. He has pending liens, unpaid bills. And now, out of desperation, he has tried to use your name to apply for a large loan. But thanks to us closing everything off in time, he was rejected. I stared at the papers in silence, not out of surprise but out of confirmation. I already knew Daniel was capable of that. The only thing that surprised me was how far he had fallen. "And what does he want to do now?" I asked. "He's saying you took what was rightfully his, that you left him with nothing." "And what did you say to him? That what isn't earned with respect can't be claimed with shouting." That phrase made me smile. Matthew was a just man, and knowing I had someone like him on my side gave me peace. I left the office with the folder in my hand, and as I walked through the downtown streets, I passed a young couple pushing a baby stroller. They stopped to look at shop windows, laughed quietly, held hands. And I thought of Teresa and me when we were young, when we dreamed of having our own home, a united family. I remembered how I held Daniel for the first time in the early morning hours at the hospital, when the nurses placed him in my trembling arms. How I swore he would never lack for anything. And I kept that promise. He lacked nothing. What I never imagined was that one day he would see me as a burden, as someone who should just disappear. I returned to the center later and tried to shake off the sadness. I sat with the others to listen to stories. A woman was telling how she learned to embroider from her grandmother in a small town. Another talked about his time as a mariachi musician. And little by little, the sorrow began to fade. Because that's what a healthy community does. It heals you without you even realizing it. One random Sunday, while we were preparing for a Grandparents' Day event, the center's doorbell rang. I opened the main door, and there was Daniel alone with wrinkled clothes, sunken eyes, and an envelope in his hand. He looked at me intently. There was no anger on his face. There was exhaustion. A deep exhaustion, like someone who has no more excuses to offer. He didn't say a single word. He just handed me the envelope. I took it without opening it. He looked at me again and left. Just like that. Without saying anything. Without asking for forgiveness, without making demands, without crying. He just left. I waited until I was alone in my office at the center to open the envelope. Inside there was a brief letter. It said, "Dad, I lost everything. The money, the job, my family. I have nothing left. But I realized the only thing I truly lost was you." I didn't cry. I had no tears left for that. I just closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and was thankful that I hadn't given up. Because if I had given up when he called me a useless old man, I wouldn't be standing here today. I wouldn't have built this refuge. I wouldn't have met these men and women who gave me back my hope. And most importantly, I wouldn't have found myself again. That night before going to sleep, I went out onto my apartment balcony. The air was cool. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and a single solitary star shone brightly above everything. I looked at the sky and whispered, "Thank you, Teresa, for not letting me fall." And because yes, sometimes you talk to those who are gone and you feel that somehow they can still hear you. After that last letter, Daniel never appeared again. Not a call, not a message, not even a silent visit like that time at the cafe. It was as if his presence had vanished, as if he had dissolved into his own defeat. But I don't say this with resentment. Not anymore. I say it with the serenity of someone who understood that some people only return when they need something, and when there's nothing left to take, they simply disappear. And even though it hurt me, even though he carried my blood in his veins, I had already accepted that. That not all bonds are eternal. That there are relationships you have to let go of to save yourself. What became clear to me is that I was never again going to let someone else define my worth. Meanwhile, the grandparents' house had become a well-known place throughout the city. People came from faraway neighborhoods. Some took 2 buses just to come and share a coffee and a conversation. And everyone, absolutely everyone, brought a story with them. Some were stories of abandonment, others of struggle, many of loss. But all of them, without exception, were stories of courage. Because living for so many years is no small feat. Because to endure when no one calls you anymore, when the phone no longer rings, when your children don't show up, even for birthdays, is a silent act of bravery that almost no one recognizes. One Monday morning, while I was watering the garden, I ran into Mr. Abel, one of the quietest old men in the group. He almost never spoke, but that day he looked me straight in the eye and said, "Thank you, Ezekiel, because here they started calling me by my name again. At my house, nobody remembers my name anymore. They just call me the old man, if they call me anything at all." I froze. I didn't know what to say. I just put my hand on his shoulder and said, "Here you are, not an old man. Here you are, Mr. Abel, and your voice matters." He nodded, his eyes moist. And that moment left a mark on me because I realized we weren't saving bodies. We were saving names, memories, identities. A few days later, a woman came looking for me. Her name was Martha. She must have been in her late 50s, well-dressed, her hair tied back, a tired but dignified face. She introduced herself as Daniel's ex-wife. I was surprised not by her presence, but because I had never spoken with her beyond distant family gatherings. She told me she needed to talk to me alone. I took her to my office at the center, and we sat facing each other. She looked at me with honesty and said it all. "I didn't come here to speak ill of Daniel. I'm not interested in that. But I do want to thank you because what you are doing here saved my children. Ever since they came to see you, they've changed. They started asking about you, speaking with more respect, helping around the house, valuing different things." Her voice broke. "Daniel has hit rock bottom, Mr. Ezekiel. It doesn't excuse him, but it's the truth. He lost his job, he lives in a boarding house, and he barely sees the kids. And despite everything, they still love him. And the only thing they ask for is to see you again." I looked at her in silence. I felt a mix of emotions that was hard to explain. On one hand, the old wounded man still living inside me wanted to say, "It's too late for Daniel." But the other part of me, the one that had been reborn in this place, understood that life always comes full circle, and that sometimes true love isn't about forgetting, but about maintaining a respectful distance. I told her, "Martha, my grandsons will always have a place here. Always, as long as I'm breathing. But Daniel, he will have to find his own way, alone." She nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She just stood up, thanked me with a brief hug, and left. That day I stayed at the center longer than usual. I sat on one of the courtyard benches under the shade of a bougainvillea we had recently planted. I listened to the laughter of the other grandparents, the slow footsteps, the murmur of long conversations. And I thought about what we had achieved, how without seeking it, this place had become my family. A different kind of family. A family without a last name, without inheritance, without obligation. A family built from tenderness and shared pain. That night when I got home, I opened my notebook and wrote a single sentence. "He who learns to live with dignity no longer depends on the love of those who couldn't see him." And I felt it with the full weight of my soul. Because after so many years of swallowed silences, of misunderstood respect, of humiliations, disguised as jokes, I had finally found myself. And I liked who I was. The following week, we celebrated the center's first anniversary. I didn't send out formal invitations, just spread the word among those who came regularly. But to my surprise, more than 100 people showed up that day. Some brought homemade cakes, others brought flowers from the market. Others just brought their presents and their stories. We had a simple service in the courtyard. We hung up old photos of those who were no longer with us. We sang songs from our childhood. And there among those trembling voices, I saw my grandsons arrive alone unannounced. They walked with confidence, carrying a wrapped box in their hands. They searched for me in the crowd, and when they found me, they hugged me as if they had crossed a desert. "Grandpa, this is for you." I opened the box. Inside was a handmade scrapbook with photos of us, letters they had written me, drawings from when they were little. I couldn't speak. I just hugged them and they understood. Because there are gestures that say more than any word. Because even though I no longer expected anything, life still had something saved for me. After that anniversary, something in the atmosphere of the center changed. It wasn't a visible change or something you could point to, but it felt like when it rains after a long drought, and suddenly the air smells different, as if everything is breathing more deeply. Maybe it was me, maybe it was them, or maybe we were all feeling that this place, born from silence and humiliation, had now become a sacred refuge for those of us who carried years' memories and wounds on our shoulders. No one asked anymore who had built the center. Nor was it important who ran it, because we all felt it was ours. Every brick, every plant in the garden, every hand-painted bench had a piece of our history attached to it. And although I was the one who built it all, I no longer felt like the owner. I felt like a part of it, just like everyone else. My grandsons started coming frequently. They would look for me on weekends, help serve coffee, organize small activities, read books aloud to the grandparents who couldn't see well anymore. It was beautiful to see how they got involved without anyone asking them to. No one forced them. They came because they wanted to. And that for an old man like me who no longer expected anything from his own blood was like a gift from heaven. One day the youngest, who was only 10, told me, "Grandpa, when I grow up, I want to do something like this, but for kids." I looked at him, ruffled his hair, and said, "Then start by respecting your elder's son, because he who doesn't honor the past doesn't know how to build the future." He smiled and hugged me tightly. That hug sustained me for the whole week. One Wednesday afternoon, I received a letter. This time it wasn't from Daniel. It was from the city government. They wanted to recognize the work of the center. They offered me a medal, a public acknowledgement, an event with the press and everything. I read it several times, not out of vanity, but out of disbelief, because I never sought applause. This all began from a wound, and it didn't seem right to pin a medal on myself for having survived the pain. I went to the center that same afternoon and gathered all the grandparents who were there at the moment. I read the letter to them out loud, without emotion, just as information, and then I asked them, "What do you want me to do? Should I accept?" One of them, Mr. Luis, stood up with effort from his chair and said, "Accept it, Ezekiel, but not for yourself. Accept it for all of us, because that medal isn't yours. It belongs to every single one of us who walked through that door and felt alive again." And in that moment, I knew I had to do it. Not for pride, but out of respect for everyone's story. The event was held in a public square. There was press cameras, chairs lined up a simple stage. They handed me a diploma, a bronze medal, and a bouquet of flowers that I immediately gave to a lady in the audience. I gave a short speech. I didn't write it. I spoke as I always do, from the heart. I said, "Thank you for this, but don't give it to me. Give it to every grandparent you have ignored on the sidewalks, in hospital lines, on the bus. Give it to the man who lives alone on the corner of your street, to the woman who takes care of her grandchildren without anyone ever thanking her. I just did what I had to do, because being old is not a sentence. It's a privilege. And whoever doesn't understand that is because they haven't learned how to live." When I finished, there wasn't exaggerated applause, just a long silence and a few discreet tears in the eyes of those listening. And that was enough for me. Days later at the center, we started a new activity, a letter-writing workshop. We gave paper and pens to all the grandparents and suggested they write whatever they wanted to someone who was gone, to an absent child, to a partner they missed, to their younger selves. And what emerged was powerful. Letters filled with pain, with gratitude, with anger, with tenderness. One woman wrote a letter to her little dog that had died 10 years ago. Another wrote to the father who abandoned him. And me, I wrote a letter to myself. I sat in the office with my usual notebook and began. Dear Ezekiel, I ask for your forgiveness. Forgive me for staying silent so many times, for pretending to be okay when you were broken, for not raising your voice when they called you useless. But I also want to thank you. Thank you for not giving up, for transforming pain into a refuge, for creating a home with your own hands. Thank you for keeping going, even when no one was waiting for you. I closed the notebook with trembling hands, and I felt that I had finally reconciled with myself. One Friday at dusk, as we were closing the windows of the center, Mr. Roger approached me. That quiet man who was now one of the pillars of the place. He said, Ezekiel, you know what makes me happy about coming here? That here we don't have to pretend to be strong. Here we can say that we're tired, that we're in pain, that we miss someone, and nobody judges us. They just listen. I hugged him without saying a word, because he was right. Because that's what we needed most. A space to be vulnerable without fear, without shame. A space where being old didn't mean having to be invisible. That night before sleeping, I sat in my favorite armchair, the one I bought with my first salary as a bricklayer, and looked around. The walls had pictures of my grandsons, but also drawings made by the grandparents from the center. The scent of cinnamon from the coffee I had made in the afternoon still lingered in the air. Outside, the city lights twinkled, and inside me, there was a peace I had never known. Because I was no longer the Ezekiel who wondered what he had done wrong as a father. Now I was the Ezekiel who knew what he had done right as a human being. A few days ago, while I was watering the plants in the center's garden, a little girl about 7 years old approached me. She was with her grandmother. She had 2 long braids and a paper flower in her hand. She looked at me without fear, with those eyes that still don't know malice, and asked, "Are you the one who built this place?" I bent down slowly, looked her in the eyes, and said, "No, little one. This place was built by the love of many grandparents like yours." She smiled, handed me the flower, and ran back to her grandmother. And there I was with that piece of paper in my hand, trembling inside. Understanding that perhaps what I had built most in my life wasn't houses or contracts or deeds, but a new form of dignity. The center is now bigger than I ever imagined. There are workshops every day. There's music. There's dancing. There are prayers. There are silences that don't weigh you down. The volunteers are multiplying. The community breathes differently. Even the young people who used to see the elderly only as a burden now approach with respect. Some come to help others simply to listen. And that is priceless. Because you can lose many things in life: money, family, health. But if they take away your chance to be heard, then they take away your soul. Here in this house, no one is invisible. And that's what makes me most proud. I don't know how much time I have left. No one knows. But every day I wake up, I drink my coffee slowly, I take a deep breath, and I give thanks. I am thankful for not giving up when they called me a useless old man. I am thankful for not responding with hate, for choosing the path of quiet work. Because if I've learned anything in this life, it's that true power lies in the silence that builds, not in the scream that destroys. And although I sometimes feel tired, although there are days when my body aches and my back cracks, I just have to look at the faces of my companions to remember why I'm still here. Daniel never came back. Since that letter, I haven't heard from him again. My grandsons, on the other hand, now come almost every weekend. They help me water the plants, arrange things, paint. One of them learned to use a drill, the other makes drawings that we then put up on the main mural in the center. They ask me for stories from the past. They listen to me attentively. And sometimes without saying it, I know they are learning more than they ever did in school. Because there is no better teacher than example, and there is no better inheritance than shared memory. They may not fully understand what happened between their father and me, but they see, they perceive. And I just hope that when they grow up, they become different men. Men who don't repeat mistakes, who don't turn their backs, who don't call the one who gave them life useless. The day I turned 79, they prepared a surprise for me at the center. I'm not one for parties, but I accepted. They made me a caramel cake, hung up recycled balloons, and even brought a mariachi band of senior citizens that rehearses at the local community center. When I sat in the middle of the room, surrounded by people who don't share my blood, but love me like family, I understood that this was true wealth, not the signed papers, not the properties. What remains when everything else is gone are the bonds, the stories whispered in your ear, the hands that help you up when your body falters. And that afternoon, with a cardboard hat on my head, surrounded by laughter and hugs, I felt like the luckiest man in the world. Many people ask me what sustained me, what kept me from falling completely. Some think it was the desire for revenge. Others that it was pride. But the truth is, it was memory. The memory of Teresa, my wife. Her soft voice, her unwavering faith, her words of encouragement. When I would come home tired and dirty from the construction site, the way she looked at me as if I could always handle anything. She was my strength even after she was gone. And in every corner of the center, in every flower that blooms in the garden, in every corner where laughter is heard or bread is shared, I feel that she is still with me, that she didn't leave me alone, that she gave me strength from another place. Today I live in a small apartment next to the center. I don't need more. I have the essentials, my bed, my books, my old radio, and a window from which I can see the grandparents arriving every morning. Some drag their feet, others lean on a cane. But they all arrive with enthusiasm, with life, with something to say. And that for me is enough. I no longer have luxuries, but I have peace. I no longer have all the answers, but I have certainties. And the most important of all is that I did not fail myself. That despite the betrayal, the abandonment, the contempt, I chose to keep going, and I did so with dignity. Some days when I feel more reflective, I walk through the hallways of the center and stop to look at the photos hanging on the wall. Images of workshops, of trips, of birthdays, of hugs. In one of them, I'm there with a shovel in my hand, covered in dust, smiling. I look at it and smile again. Because that man in the photo is me. But he is also everyone. He is every person who fell and got back up. He is every grandparent who was called a burden and is now an example. He is every story of quiet resistance that nobody tells on television, but that is worth more than any novel. And that's why I decided to leave this written down. Because I don't want my story to be lost when I'm no longer here. Because maybe somewhere there is another old man listening to this with wet eyes, wondering if it's worth continuing. And I want him to know that yes, it is always worth it. That even with a broken heart, even with empty hands, you can build something beautiful. And that it doesn't matter if your own children didn't see you. There are other people in the world who will see your value, who will know who you are, who will listen to you. And so my son, my grandson, whoever is hearing this story, I tell you from my soul, never let anyone take away your dignity. It doesn't matter if they call you a burden, if they tell you you're useless. You know what you're worth. You know what you gave. You know who you are. And if the day comes when everything seems lost, take a deep breath and start again. Because as long as you are breathing, there is always something left to plant. And now if you've made it this far, thank you for listening to me. And I also want to ask you something. Did this story touch your heart in any way? And tell me also, from what little corner of the world are you listening to me? Because even if I can't see you, I like to think that out there on the other side, there is someone like you who understands what it feels like to live with an open soul.